Hello and welcome to this series of tutorials on tracking and compositing 3D objects into Nuke. So what we're going to do in this series of tutorials is track this 3D scene here. I'm just going to play or this scene here. I'm just going to play it through for you, okay? And you can see that there's a sort of considerable amount of camera movement going on in this scene. So what we want to do is track this scene and then composite a 3D element into this scene, okay? Now, just to give you an idea of the sort of final version, then this is what we're trying to achieve here. So now I've got this 3D element, this chair that I've added to the scene, and as I actually, I'm just going to scrub this bit forward that I've previewed here. As the scene plays, or as the camera moves, you can see that our 3D object is tracked and moving through the scene with it. Okay, great. So that's what we're trying to achieve. So our first challenge is to actually track this 3D scene, okay, and track it in 3D, okay. Now, before we actually go into tracking, what we need to do is we need to undistort this scene, okay. So naturally, with any camera that you're using or any lens that you're using, there's a certain amount of lens distortion that affects our image, okay. And what we want to do is get rid of that lens distortion before we start tracking the scene, okay? So what I've done is I've shot a lens distortion grid here. So if I just connect that to my viewing node, so this is my lens distortion grid. I've shot this lens distortion grid with exactly the same camera and lens that I used to actually shoot this scene with, okay? And all I did was basically put the lens distortion grid against a wall and shoot it. And just make sure that the camera is kind of really sort of accurate and face onto it in terms of 90 degrees. Okay. Now, you don't have to be spot on accurate with these lens distortion grids. The algorithm will tolerate a little bit of inaccuracy in terms of how you shoot it. I've shot this, and then all I've done is just take a single frame from that video as a TIFF, because I was shooting in raw still images anyway on my Blackmagic camera. So I just took one of those still images, converted it into a TIFF, so that we can actually read it in here. Okay, so that's my grid that I've shot. And this is just an A3 grid that I've created. I'll put the file up onto the Moodle site or as part of this tutorial, so you can use this as well when you're doing your work. Okay, so in order to undistort this, what you want to do is use a lens distortion node. Okay, so here we are. So we create a lens distortion node, and actually there's a variety of ways of using this lens distortion node. I'm just going to close these other windows just so you don't get confused. So this is the lens distortion node here. There are a variety of ways of actually analysing lens distortion. One of them is you could, if your image has got a certain amount of straight lines in it, just use image analysis. So you could literally just put the source video clip through this and just analyze the image. That's not the method I'm going to use here. The method I'm going to use here is grid analysis. So I'm going to analyze the grid. The final method is something called line analysis. So what you actually do is draw the lines onto the scene, okay, and then so what you do is draw straight lines onto the scene, showing basically showing on the scene what should be straight lines, okay, when it's undistorted. So let's say you had a pavement or a window or something with straight edges. You could draw straight lines around that, and then it's going to pick that up and go, okay, that should be a straight line. Okay, so but what we're going to use the grid analysis, and all we do is put in this grid image, and then we basically go analyze grid. Okay. Now, as a result of doing that, when we analyze grid, it doesn't look like anything's happened, but actually what's happened here is it's given us some numbers here. So it's given us some distortion numbers, okay, that we can then use to undistort the image, okay. So I'm just going to show you, demonstrate this on this, I'm just going to demonstrate it on the grid directly so you can see it a bit easier. So this is the original image, okay, and now this is the undistorted version of it. Okay, so that's the original undistorted. So you can see actually the lens is fairly straight anyway, there wasn't a lot that needed to be done in order to undistort it, but you can see there's a little bit of curve here, there's a little bit of curve there, and then when we undistort it, i.e. we see the output of this lens distortion, when we see the output of this lens distortion, that it's now undistorted. Also, part of this is when we look at things through the cinema or movies, we expect to see some lens distortion. So actually, one of the things we're going to want to do is, after we've comped this, and I will touch on this a bit later, after we've composited this, what we're going to want to do is add that lens distortion back on again. So you'll notice here we've got a setting here that says undistort. If I uncheck that, okay, it will basically add the distortion back on for me. Okay, so I'm either undistorting or adding the distortion back on. In fact, you can see it's sort of, when I click undistort here, it's actually adding the distortion to the already distorted image. So you can actually see it's kind of accentuating the distortion that was actually there. Okay, so I'm going to keep this on undistort, but what I'm going to do is basically create a copy of this, okay, and then click undistort. Okay, and then what you'll see is if I click here, this is the original image. Okay, let me just set up my views for you. Okay, so that's the original image. This is the undistorted image. Sorry, hang on, let me get this right. I want to click. What I've actually done inadvertently, I'm just going to start again on this one because I've made a slight error. What I did was I actually clicked the undistort of the original lens distortion. So I'm going to click, or I turned off the undistort. I'm going to click undistort again. Then what I'm going to do is copy this lens distortion, open that up here. Now it gets a bit confusing, but lens distortion 2, the one we've just opened, is actually up here. Okay. Again, it might be worth sort of labeling these. So if I call it distort, and then I'll call this one undistort. Okay, so what I've done now, so this one's going to undistort, okay, and then the distort one, that's this one here, is going to distort it. Okay, so I want to turn off undistort. Okay, let's go through this again. So that's 2. Okay, so let me just show you what we've got here. So now that's the original image. This is the undistorted version of the image. Okay, you can see, and then this is with the distortion back on. So you can see we've put the distortion back on here. Okay, now obviously this particular setup is completely useless, but in reality what we would want to do is we could undistort it, track it, put our 3D elements in there, and then re-distort it again just before we output it. Okay, and I will talk about that in how undistortion fits into this workflow a little bit later after we've done our tracking. But for the moment, really what you want to be aware of is that we do want to undistort at some point, and that we do want to put the distortion back on at some point, and that we want to undistort in order to sort of undistort footage in order to track it. Okay, so let me just I'm just going to get rid of this the redistortion that we created. Get rid of that now. And then what I want to do is, obviously, I want to take this undistort and apply that to this sequence here. This is the sequence that we actually want to undistort. All I've got to do is just take this source image, and just apply it to there. So all the distortion information that it picked up from analyzing the grid when we clicked Analyze Grid, okay, has all been picked up, okay, and now it's now it's just applying that to this image. So this image is now undistorted. Okay, so we should be able to see a slight difference. I mean, it might be very subtle. Let's see what we can see here. So if I go, let's have a look. Okay, so this is the undistorted version of the image, and then this is the distorted version of the image. So you can see there is a slight difference in there, and you can see that that is having an effect. Okay,